In 1926, on March 28th, I was born at the Long Island College Hospital in downtown Brooklyn. However, my family didn't live in Brooklyn at that point. My immediate family lived up in Manhattan in what was called Hamilton Heights, and we apparently, I have no memory of this, lived opposite City College.
Mm-hmm.
And how I came to be born in downtown Brooklyn when my mother was pregnant
Uh-huh.
in uptown Manhattan, um, that's an interesting conundrum because my mother rarely, if ever, voluntarily stepped into a taxi. It was always the use for subway or a bus or a streetcar. So I have some imaginary vision of my mother breaking water in the middle of the subway on the way from uptown Manhattan to downtown Brooklyn. At any rate, I was born at Long Island College Hospital, someplace that my father, at 64, died.
Mm.
And this was like 1962 or so
Uh-huh.
that he died there. And I don't have any memory. We apparently moved to Brooklyn, to 18th Avenue in Bensonhurst, which was in striking distance of my maternal grandparents' home on 23rd Avenue in Brooklyn, very much on the border with Flatbush. Eventually, we moved to 62nd Street and 23rd Avenue, a block and a half or 2 blocks from my grandparents' house, and that is my first real memory, sitting in a hallway that went into the kitchen, and there was one of these low closets in which my mother kept pots and pans, and I remember sitting and playing with the pots and pans. And I don't know how old I was. It couldn't have been more than 2, probably less. And from there, and I verified this with my parents, that this was a real memory, that was indeed the architecture of the apartment, and that's where the pots were. And so apparently I was doing that. And the next memory I have is we moved into the building that my grandparents owned at 6403 23rd Avenue. And we were in an upstairs back apartment. It was a 3-apartment building. When that whole area was built up from having been truck farming and the like, as soon as the subways were put through after the First World War. So I believe that building was put up around 1921, and my grandfather, who was very hard-working, industrious, sentimental, cruel old son of a bitch, had moved. He married when they were teenagers my grandmother, and they moved from North Poland near Lithuania, very close to Lithuania, as far as I can determine. They were never very clear about their geography with me. But he did say they came from a town called Ostrova, I believe. I can't remember now. I looked it up at one point. There were 4 of them in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
But this one seems to have been the one near Lithuania where they lived. And in the 1880s, late 1880s, when that huge Jewish movement was moving out of the Pale, that area of of Russia and Poland, where Jews were permitted to live, and they came to this country. But they moved to England first, to Leeds, where my grandfather must have worked in one of the mills, in one of the fabric mills or clothing mills, I don't know, something like that. And there were cousins that moved there too. And my mother was born there, in Leeds, a fact that she never let us forget. You know, she's very proud of having been born in Leeds and raised in London, though they got here when she was 5 or something like this, to this country. She used to say that she was born in Leeds and raised in London, and Victoria was her queen. So, thereby hangs another interesting tale. Is my mother, who spoke American very well, I mean, she was entirely Americanized, spoke English well. But she also spoke Yiddish, as did my father. They spoke, understood Yiddish, and conversed with their parents in Yiddish. So Yiddish was a language I grew up with, never learned to speak, but that I understood and followed. And it's a very expressive language, very, very malleable, and it's unfortunate that we're losing it, or have lost it perhaps by now. And my mother could write and read in Yiddish, and she would write letters for the family in Yiddish to relatives. Some of those relatives, I believe, were still in Poland. And then I have a slight memory of my great-aunt Flora, who was my grandfather Weingard's, my mother's maiden name, who lived in a mirror image of our building across an alley that led to the garages behind the building and little garden patches. And that building was, Flora lived in with her husband Jack, and Flora was a hunchback. And she had a permanent kind of scar that went down her cheek like this, that looked like a tear. So she always seemed to be on the verge of crying, with one tear coming down. And she was always very kind to me and nice to me. And one day I came out, I wasn't in more than 6 of our building at 6403 23rd Avenue, and she was sitting on the bench leading up to the steps that went into our house. And she had a pair of new work boots, brand new work boots, and she was covering them with mud. She was rubbing mud all over them. And I said, "Why are you doing that with new shoes?" And she said, "Well, we're sending them to our relatives in Poland, and if they look old, then they won't be stolen by the postal people." So that it was a way of getting to them. That was the last I ever heard of those relatives, whom I'm sure were murdered by the Nazis and the conspiring anti-Semitic Poles. So that's practically all I know about our roots in North Central Europe. My father's family, the Edelmans, came from Minsk area. My grandfather, I asked my grandfather, and he said they came from Minsk, Gubornia. I guess that meant province or area of Minsk, which was also in the Pale at that point. And they too got here very early, with the beginning of that wave in 1880 of the Jews that left the Pale and came to this country. The bulk of Jews that live in this country today came from that area, Ashkenazi Jews. The Jews that had lived here before essentially did not come from that area. They came from Germany and other areas of Europe, and they were a very small minority. But there was a vast outflow of Jews because the Tsar had required Jews to enter the army, something like this, I'm not sure exactly, on a 17-year subscription. They had to be served for 17 years, so families got to get out as quickly as they could. That was part of the reason that 1880 arrived. There were other reasons too, is that America was opening up in a way it had never been before because the railroads going west had been completed by, thank you to the Chinese and the Irish immigrants, not to our Native Americans. I don't mean Indians, I mean us white folk, but so those railroads were completed in the 1880s finally. They had been opened first in the 1850s, and the expansion in this country was enormous, and there was a need for these immigrants to come in and fill these places. And those oppressed Jews from Central and East Europe were happy to do it, particularly with a very reactionary Tsarist regime. And the story, my Weingart relatives, that is my mother's family, my mother's name was Greenspan, a connection there with Alan Greenspan, who is a cousin of ours, and the stories attached to my maternal grandmother, whose name was Sarah Rachel, and was that she was a very unusually attractive, beautiful young woman, blonde and blue-eyed, rare for Jews at that point, which gives one to question. And at any rate, she married, I think, when she was 16 to my grandfather, who possibly was 18 or something like that. And they had 2 children, as far as I know, in Leeds, one of whom died, and there was some dispute because I could never trust my mother's stories about these things. Early on, I understood my mother could color stories about everything very nicely, very creatively, but it took years to find out that a lot of her Bubamaises, as they was called, grandmother stories, were true or partially true, that she was always basing them in some kind of real fact that was then decorated by her imagination and her desire to seem a certain way. She could be quite creative that way. Now, whether this sister who died in infancy, many infants died in those days, was older than she was or younger than she was, I could never clearly establish. But the interesting thing is that they used this dead infant's information to get my mother on the boat coming to America to identify my mother, because they could do, if she was under 2 years old, it was free. Well, my mother was 5. How it happened, I don't know. But my mother used to say, they did not come in steerage, they came in second class, thank you. So, which may be true, which may absolutely be true, because I don't know. You could never trust these stories. You would like to be able to say these are all just fabrications, but they're not. A lot of them are based in some kind of reality, as are most folk tales. Somewhere there's a root of truth in them. And that was how my mother came here. my mother was in that interesting generation of young people who had to mediate between the new society to which her family had moved, because she could speak English clearly and she had an early education, and her family, her mother never learned English, and as a matter of fact was largely, as far as I can remember, illiterate. She was not a happy woman. It was not a good marriage with my grandfather, who, as I say, was sentimental and cruel. Indeed, I know, because my relating to him, he could only relate by being sentimental and teasing. Teasing was his big way. And that was a big thing that went on in that Weingart family. And the Weingart family was never, I mean, they were industrious, hardworking. And in my mother's generation, her younger brothers all did very well. I mean, they become middle class and upper middle class businessmen. And they owned big cars and nice houses. And they early on had TV rooms, that sort of thing. And they were good men, largely. The youngest of whom was Barney, who was 9 years older than I was. So we were in the same cohort in many ways. And he and my brother, who was 5 years older, so they were 4 years apart, bonded much more than my brother did with me, which was an unfortunate thing for me growing up, since I was shut out in many ways. My brother would shut me out, and he and Barney would tease me, and there were times when the three of us would sleep in the same bed, and they had great fun punching me and teasing me and pinching me and that sort of thing. And a good deal of my own adjustment in life has to do with that period of trying to keep up with and really being rejected by these two older siblings, on a kind of sibling. Barney had something of that cruel, teasing nature of my grandfather. My other two uncles, his elder brothers, did not have it. I think my mother had a good influence on them. By the time Barney came along, she didn't have an influence in the family. She had a sister, my Aunt Rose, who was incredibly beautiful, I can remember, as a teenager. She had wine-colored hair and a beautiful figure. And she was the most ignorant woman probably I've ever met. Her favorite reading was Silver Screen magazine, and she would drive my grandfather crazy because her boyfriends were all Italian mafia, and they would pull up in these big black limousines to pick her up, and he wouldn't let her go out. He would confront them and that sort of thing. And he sent her to work. He kept getting her jobs in factories and offices, and she kept losing them, giving up. And in her case, it was, I think there were some abortions along the line. Abortions are not a big deal. There were many, many when I was growing up. Not simply in our family, but across the board. I mean, the notion that they're going to stop existing because they become illegal again is ridiculous. There are going to be abortions. We should make them legal, and we should support, my paternal grandmother, Jenny Levy or Levine, I don't know they're really the same name, I'm told, Olivia Levine, died when my father was 11 from a botched abortion. She'd already had 5 children.
Mm.
And that left a terrible scar on my father's life, which I'll get into another time. So that eventually, just to finish the Rose story, they kept looking for a husband to marry her off with as quickly as possible. Eventually, they found one in my uncle, Irving Gordon, who was a cousin of my Uncle Dave's wife, Sarah Gordon. But these Gordons, Irving Gordons, lived up here near Boston. And he was a terribly nice man, hardworking, considerate, disciplined, and tolerated groves. And they had some children, and I think some more abortions along the line. It wasn't difficult. We had close friends of my grandfather and grandmother's family that had owned a house, a big multiple house on their ascendancy to Bensonhurst. This was in Brownsville, I believe. They were the Radens, very nice people, friends of the family. I loved visiting them when I was a little boy. And it was going back to the old neighborhood where the tenement life still existed of Jews, and which I had, that was the only connection I had with it. And one of their sons became a doctor, a very successful doctor, and he was the family, yes, he did the abortions. So that in the Weingart family, they were well taken care of because the Radens took care of it and all that sort of thing. And these are important stories because we're talking about the fabric of how life went on and the craziness of trying to stop what women have had to do from time immemorial. And the safer we can make it, the better, and the better for the children that survive, too. So much for that. And so, at any rate, my mother wanted to go to college, and being the oldest child of the family and being a girl, my grandfather would not have it. And that was too bad. It would have helped my mother to organize her relatively rich mind, but totally undisciplined and unrooted. It would have helped her enormously. She had very real aesthetic impulses. She played the violin in one of the local WPA orchestras during the Depression. I don't think she played well, but she played the violin. And her family was not very supportive. When she would play for them, when the family was together, they would make fun of her. I felt it awful then, and it was the nature of that family. They had no sense of humor, the Weingards, at all, except for Barney, the youngest, who was 9 years older than I. He and his wife, Dottie, who, when they became quite wealthy, became Dorothy, could be very funny together, and they had a sense of humor. But they were generationally so different from those that had preceded them. At any rate, my mother was largely responsible for my having entered the arts and gone into the theater and the like. It was that was her interest. She took us to the theater. She had found Butler Davenport's free theater, so we would go frequently because it was free. My mother was penny pinching. She always felt, compared to her brothers, very poverty-stricken. We were not. I mean, we were working class because my father was a laborer, but she had impulses and desires to rise higher. But she took me to museums. She enrolled me in dance classes at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. She took me to concerts, and all kinds of things like that. My father did not. My father was a highly intelligent, disciplined, but limited man. To get back to him, he was essentially without a developed aesthetic imagination, almost none whatsoever. But he was a very competent craftsman. He could handle tools beautifully and work with wood and things like that, do upholstery, and it was always wonderful to watch how well he handled things and how intelligent he was about what he was doing. The other thing about my father, I'll get down to this now, and this has to do with the difference between my parents. My earliest memory of my father was having what they called convulsions in those days. Convulsions is when an infant had a very high fever and screamed and cried. And I can remember being in my father's arms and feeling very comforted, very, very comforted. This returns to me several times during my life. That sense of security in his arms. I did not have that with my mother. My mother did not handle us well. She somehow did not have that kind of coordination, that affection that went with handling an infant. Though I identified very much with my mother through almost all of my development, and I didn't realize the deep roots of my identification with my father till many years later, when I was an adult. But earlier on, that clear identification was with my mother's artistic and feminine impulses, as opposed to my father. Partly because my father was borderline depressed, not terribly depressed in any case, just borderline depressed, tiny little line there. My mother, of course, was a psychological problem. She would take her bed in a depression summers and refused to get out of the bed, and left us, particularly my poor brother, to take care of her in the house because my father worked very hard as a milkman for Borden's, delivering milk. And and she was diagnosed several ways, from extreme problems to rather less, like what is it when you're manic depressive, yeah.
Bipolar?
Yeah, bipolar. That was the lightest one, but it was regular. It was a real feature in our life, and that we grew up with. And it generally occurred during the summer when she was not under the same responsibility of getting us through school and that sort of thing. And she would take to her bed and refuse to get out and scream things like "burn my hair" and things like terrible things for kids to grow up with. And my father was not terribly present in all that because he was, as I say, he would get up in the middle of the night to go to work because he had to deliver milk to the doorsteps, an area of Brooklyn that he served for Borden's. So that was interesting. My grandmother, near whom we lived, by this time we moved some blocks away, would come over, but as soon as she came over to help, her other children would descend and remove her because they felt it was too much of a strain on her. So this was an interesting pattern, and a lot of the heavy work fell to my brother, which affected him, I'm sure, in his life. So that about my mother, this was years later when my sons were born, and my mother would handle my sons, have them in her lap, and they would be so clearly insecure in her lap, they would flail as infants with their arms because they felt insecure in her lap. So I was able to move that back and see why that was so important. That memory of the comforting of my father had been what a respite it was from my mother, and my mother's physical contact. And that physical contact came in all kinds of shapes from my mother, who was clearly anti-sex. I mean, and I think that was not good, not kind to my father. It was deprivation. And I can remember, arguments between them in which the subject came up when I was very little. Very little gets hidden from kids who are bright enough to follow an argument, and this was clearly one of the elements that went through. So that was not a good marriage either. As I say, my father, who did not have an aesthetic sense at all, or to speak of, said to me once when he came to see me in a play, he would come and see me in a play, he said it felt like a chicken who had raised a duckling that he saw swimming, and he felt panicked by me being up on stage in front of all these people, which was a very sweet thing for him to say, and he was in touch with himself, and that was nice. The other thing about my father is that he was very good with animals. Animals relaxed the way I did as an infant with him in his presence, and he didn't even have to touch them, and they kind of relaxed. He was there. And I remember going to the barns where he picked up his horse and wagon, the loaded wagon, when he delivered milk. He was in the first half of the 30s. He was, or even a little later, he was delivering milk from a horse-drawn Borden's wagon, and he would hitch it up. And clearly the horse was glad to see him. I remember that. It's very strange. And he was glad to be with the horse. They had a real bond. He was very good about that. And he loved the horse because it was a real collaborator. He would take his containers, each containing 6 bottles of milk, in each hand, and perhaps something else with butter or eggs or what have you, that he would deliver to the doors, and sometimes in 5-story walk-ups. And the horse knew the route, so the horse would go to the next stop. So that my father came down, all he had to do was pick up the stuff and go. When Borden's converted it to trucks, he hated it because it meant he had to get into the truck each time he moved from building to building, or walk to several buildings, which he would not have done with his horse.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened sometime in the late 30s, that they gave up the horses. And but I remember we would go away, we went away for vacations, and he couldn't have been happier helping the farmer, picking up eggs, going amongst the chickens in the chicken houses, and collecting maple syrup. In those days, maple syrup were connected one tree at a time, not as they are now, where they're connected by long lines. And he was always happy about that sort of thing. And there was some connection both to my brother Gordon, who identified with that, as there was a certain kind of wanting to be part of the land, of a farm, that descended to my nephew, Seth, Gordon's oldest child, who indeed had a little farm while he was a bureaucrat in Albany. He had a 3-acre farm nearby, which he farmed with animals and things like that. And he's very good. And that comes right down the line from my father through 3 generations, and possibly earlier, because my great uncle, Kivy, who was my grandfather Edelman's brother, was for a while a potato farmer in I think New Jersey. Kivy was interesting. He was a wild one. He married an actress, I'm happy to say, and his son is a Nobel Prize winner, our cousin Jerry. So we come from a borderline distinguished family, as you can see, very borderline. And their father, who was the subject of legends in the Edelman family, was Gersha Moshe the Meshuggah. You know what Meshuggah means?
Yeah.
The crazy one.
Yeah.
This was my great-grandfather. I may have met him, but I doubt it. There are many versions of the legend, and it's a legend, of why he came to this country. But the central fact seems to be that his father ran a wine shop where you could get wine to drink and put a cup of wine, but it was subject to those very draconian laws of Brussels, Poland, about Jews, that you had to close at a certain time, etc. And he had closed the shop, and 2 either Poles, the story splits here now, as whether they were Poles or whether they were Cossacks, makes it much more colorful for the Cossacks, came in and demanded a drink, and he said, I can't give it to you because I'll be in a lot of trouble. So they killed him. Well, he was a Jew, why not? So what happened, and the story, they're similar, all along these lines, is that my uncle Gershon Moshe the Meshuggah, whose name Gershon Moses became my brother's name, Gordon Mercer. And they would anglicize into that. And Gershon Moshe the Meshuggah took his family, his brothers, himself and his children, and got out and somehow managed to arrange for them to come to this country, went back and killed these two guys.
Oh.
Whether that's true or not, but
Uh-huh.
it comes in several versions.
Uh-huh.
This is the version I had. The Cossack version is another family version. I'm sure there are others of that. But he was apparently quite brilliant and highly intelligent, inventive and daring and dangerous and all that sort of thing. And he brought his family here at the very, very beginning of that wave of Jewish immigration. And when his children were old enough to be independent, he went to Palestine, to the Wailing Wall, to expiate his sins at the Wailing Wall. But he would return occasionally to collect funds to support this habit. But he was apparently a brilliant and inventive, imaginative man. And my great-uncle Kivy was a good deal like that. Not my grandfather. My grandfather had a sense of humor. The Edelmans had a sense of humor, and they were intellectually inclined as opposed to the Weingarts. They produced doctors and dentists and lawyers and all that sort of thing very quickly and easily. And part of that was my grandfather having arranged that. He settled on, and he had a wonderful sense of humor, but it was very dry. Oh boy, was it dry, and very difficult for a little kid to deal with. But it wasn't cruel, it was just dry. He had arranged for his sons, at least the first 3 or 4 of them, as to what he expected them to do when they grow up. Jack, the eldest, was to become a dentist, which indeed he did. My father was to become a pharmacist, who in those days was a very important part of the community, because they were the local doctors, the pharmacists. Not only did they really compound the medicines, because there weren't that many medicine from Big Pharma yet, they compounded them right there in their shop. But they also did first aid, and they did what is done, what's the entry level in a hospital, emergency. They did emergency work. And they would determine whether somebody had to be sent to the hospital, the doctor. It was an important position in the community in those days. And then my uncle Isaac Zick, became a physician, very successful physician. Private practice, made house calls, but he did extraordinarily well, and he became a wealthy man, and stayed very much in that Irish community in Richmond Hill, Queens, where he started his practice and stayed till the end of his practice, 50 or so years later, more, in which he would deliver people, children, and bury them. And he was intelligent, enthusiastic, and he and my Aunt Emily had an architect build them a very lovely, wonderful house in which he had a suite of offices, a suite, not just one room, lots of them, and big, beautiful living and dining quarters, and garage for their cars, and quarters for their maid, etc. I mean, he did it, and he did it well, and he did it honorably.
Mm-hmm.
And he worked very hard, and I remember going with him several times in his car and waiting as he made house calls. He would go out with his black satchel to look in on a patient. And then the 4th son, my Uncle Philip, my grandfather for whatever reason, decided he would have my grandfather's profession. My grandfather was a cutter in dress factories, which is the most important thing because they use machines to cut through piles of fabric, and you go wrong on one, and you've cost the company thousands of dollars. And so he trained Philip to do that. So Philip had a comfortable income doing that, and unfortunately he died of a heart attack on the subway going to or from work in his early 50s. And then there was Benny, who was just too young when my grandmother Jenny died. And Benny was interesting because he grew up largely in the Depression, and he became something of a hobo and something of a racetrack tout. And he was a nice man, very kind, very good, good looking, very good looking. I think the best looking one of the family. He and my father were the best looking ones. And he took me to the racetracks. And I can remember sitting on his shoulders and meeting some of the jockeys and patting the horses that Benny took me to. It was lovely. It was very nice. Eventually, long, he married, I think her name was Jean. And she came of an Orthodox Jewish family, of which we were not. We were conservative, whatever that meant, on the way out, Jews. And she would speak of my Benny when she spoke of him. Always, it was lovely. She was so devoted to him. And they had 2 children who grew up to be Orthodox Jews because she was very Orthodox. And I was in touch with them for a while. They used to live out at Rockaway Beach. And I don't know what's happened to them, except I do know that the elder, the daughter, was married, Orthodox marriage, and had an Orthodox divorce that she didn't escape, but her husband did. But that's all I know about it. And then, when my grandmother, Jenny, was still alive, she had brought, I think, and I'm not sure about any of this. I mean, these are all kinds of semi-facts. Brought over her niece to help with the family, because apparently Jenny was active in the community. She was something of a social organizer, and you know, a real Edelman woman, unlike the Weingart women. And she was the one that had that botched abortion and died of septicemia in the hospital when my father was 11. That's something my father, I think, never got over. He had that 11-year-old depression that, you know, just on the verge of adolescence from the loss of his mother. And although he never spoke of it very much at all, but looking back, one sees it. But he'd never gotten over it. And he had a rough adolescence. And when he was 17, he disappeared for a while, and apparently went to live on the Bowery. The Bowery was where I don't know what the tramps and the like lived, where you could get a bed for 50 cents a night, and that sort of thing, for some time, a few weeks or so. I have no further information. But a very rare thing to happen to, you know, a good Jewish family, very rare. And then the next thing I know about my father is he was drafted in 1917 for the First World War, and he was like 21 or 22, I don't remember now. And I could work it out, but so he was sent overseas, and they went to England for a while, and then to France, and he was in the big battles that the Americans fought, and indeed was gassed in the First World War, which stayed with him naturally until it killed him when he was 64. That and 2 packs of Camels a day when he died, actually on the operating table. My uncles, 2 physicians, had arranged for the best surgeon in New York, famous heart surgeon and lung surgeon, to operate. And the knife slipped and cut his pericardium, and my father bled to death and drowned in his own blood. He would have been dead anyway in 6 months, and perhaps that was just as well. The cancer was very far advanced, and so the last my memory of my father was in the recuperation room, which was large and dark, and my father, they had him hooked up to various kinds of things, but they were waiting for him to die, and they were just sustaining him. And he rose up and pulled the connections, these plastic and rubber connections, the tubes, from himself. And he rose up and couldn't have been more like a horse. He seemed to be a horse. And that seemed so right for my father to somehow embody something like that. And that was the last I remember him. Dead.
Wow.
And he was a good man.
Mm-hmm.
So, then for my mother lived many years longer than that. She lived in her mid-87 or so. She never admitted to being older than my father. She would fib about her or lie about her age. We could never establish when our birthday was. And that was a marriage of rebound for my mother. She apparently had a very close connection with a young architect who was very creative, and as a matter of fact, I think I still have some of the plans he had for a cottage they were going to have when they got married that he did for her. It was called Mr. B. I think it was Berkowitz, but I think it was Mr. B. And he had a limp, I think he had a bad leg or something gone. So my grandfather would have none of it. It's terrible things like this in one's life. But which would have been a much better marriage for my mother. I wouldn't have been here to tell the story, but it would have been a much better marriage for my mother. She was clearly devoted to him and devoted to what he did and what his identity was and that sort of thing. I remember meeting him once, not many blocks, perhaps 10 blocks from where we lived. We were walking, and he came apparently with his wife. And that's all I remember, that they met. I must have been 11 or 12 years old at that point. And so my mother, who had known my father, I think married on the rebound, largely there. My father was very handsome and a nice man. And they, what was called eloped in those days. And they were married just before he went overseas to fight in the First World War. And this was a problem of contention in the Edelman family, since the money was not going to them from his paycheck, but to my mother. And they didn't. It was at any rate, when he got back, they got married in 1919 on December 31st, 1919. And I still have some of the artifacts from my father's having been in the war. I have his dress uniform, and I have mine from the Second World War, both of which are supposed to go to my grandson, Liam. We keep advancing through the generations, and some of them medals and kinds of things that were given for them. And then in 1938, in celebration of 10 years after the war to end all wars, when Hitler was already ravaging Europe, or almost on the verge of it anyway, there was a great parade in New York, up Fifth Avenue or down Fifth Avenue, I don't remember. And my uncle Irving, the middle brother, my mother's middle brother, who was by this time the manager of the most important umbrella manufacturing showroom, and had an office facing the Empire State Building on the third floor over Fifth Avenue. I used to love going there because I could play with the umbrellas, and the umbrellas were displayed on revolving stands. You could spin them and that sort of thing. And he would permit me to do that. And he was always very generous to me. And he was the most civilized in a social sense of my brothers, my mother's three brothers, Irving. And they had the close relationship in the family, Irving and my mother. Irving had fallen off the fire escape when he was a little boy. They were sleeping on the fire escape in the hot weather, and somehow managed to make him shorter than anybody in the family. But he was a nice, good, kind, good-looking man. So that when that parade came, my father wasn't in it, but down or up Fifth Avenue, I sat on the sill of this building with my feet dangling down, watching the parade on Fifth Avenue. And then my father got to see I wasn't with him, but I can recall some of his old buddies from the First World War. And just as one more aspect of that, my father was drafted into Camp Upton, which was on Long Island, and was a place where recruits were brought in and gotten ready to send off to the various other places in the army that they were going to go. And indeed, that's where I went in the Second World War, to Camp Upton. And so there was a little connection there. And let's see. I think we should stop.
All
Thank
right.
you.